Uh, you spoke yesterday about freedom of speech. I remember in the late 80s or early 90s, Ice-T came out with an album. And of course, I was a young kid. I wanted to hear all the bad stuff. Anything that just sounded raunchy and made my parents upset was going to make me happy. I love Wu-Tang.
Yeah.
I didn't really get to Ice-T because I was on the East Coast. That was more West Coast stuff. But there was a big pushback at the time because the name of his album was Cop Killer.
Yes.
Now that sounds that's pretty mild today, given that we have, much worse, much more diabolical music, in my opinion. But that brought up the issue of, should this rap music be allowed in our culture? And there were people that were pushing back at the time. What are your thoughts on that? Like, you spoke about freedom of speech. Is there some speech that should be curbed because it creates vice and error in the culture?
No, I don't think so. I'm very anti-censorship. I think that the existing laws that exist in the USA in regards to freedom of speech are pretty close to where they should be, with very limited and specific limitations, direct calls and threats to credible threats of violence, promoting, I guess, like terroristic activity in a credible fashion, things like libel, slander, false advertising, reckless endangerment. People always say, yelling fire when there's no fire in a crowded theater. That's the thing people always say. I think those very slight limitations are kind of the best we can do. I think freedom of speech freedom in general is first of all, there's always going to be trade-offs. Then there's always going to be things which are just enforceable and not. But then I think the biggest problem is always, if you're going to consider something offensive or objectionable, I think the biggest issue there is that it's just so subjective. It's incredibly subjective, and that there's no person who can be on authority and the absolute morality on what is quote unquote harmful or quote unquote offensive, right? Obviously, I spoke at the university and you were there, and there were people there who did not want me to be allowed to speak because to them, whether or not they're even familiar with me, they had somehow decided that I'm quote unquote dangerous, or I'm putting students at risk, or I'm somehow I'm hateful, or I'm offensive, all these type of words. And we all have our different sensibilities and our belief systems and the things that we stand for and the things that we're against and so on, based on our families, our religion, our culture, our nation, our values, our individual, our personality types, our experiences. And so if you were to go down a road of, okay, anything that offends someone or potentially offends someone, that's
subjective.
Yeah, it's incredibly subjective, and it quickly can descend into tyranny. And this has happened. I mean, it exists in some parts around the world. You're not allowed to say X. You can't criticize the political class. You can't say anything against the people's religious beliefs, or even not follow them. You can't say this. You can't say that. You can't say that. And very quickly, it's like, well, we've all got our things, right? There's a lot of stuff I see and I hear every single day on social media, online, offline. There's stuff I see every day which offends me. But I'm also a grown man, and I'm mature, and I don't think you can nerf the world.
Okay, so feelings are subjective, and being offended is a feeling. You choose to be offended. Do you believe that there is objective truth?
Yes.
And do you believe that it is the responsibility of leaders to steer people away from, or let me put it this way, steer people towards truth and away from error?
Yes.
Given that, do you think that, and we see the ultimate end of liberal democracy with what we're experiencing in this inversion of the freedom of speech, where truth is actually being censored and degeneracy is being upholded, and most of the degeneracy is a byproduct of our craving for sin, for sensuality, for quote unquote freedom. We have Kanye West right now, yay. And he came up preaching a whole lot of things that were fun to listen to, but also in error, right? But today he finds himself in a bind because he's being criticized for speaking truth. I guess my question, or even what I'm proposing, is that we've gotten to a point where the freedom of speech, liberty, because in my opinion is erroneous. I think freedom of speech is wrong.
Okay,
I think there needs to be a limit.
What's your position
on freedom of speech?
Okay,
but I'll tell you why.
Okay,
because what we see today is the byproduct of unrestrained freedom of speech, where now the very weapon by which we were able to achieve virtue and liberation has now been turned around and is being used like guns. Guns can be used to liberate and to free.
Yes.
But also can be used to create chaos.
Agreed.
And so the place where we find ourselves in, which is the ultimate logical end of unrestrained freedom of speech, is where now those who are in complete error are free to speak. And you can speak as much error as you want. You can speak as much degeneracy and debauchery as you want. You could pump this into the brains of our children through hypnotic music. But the minute someone like Ye or anybody else speaks out in a way that questions the narrative and proposes perhaps a more virtuous truth, is now taken down. So would you say that, given that full liberation of freedom of speech, we have now found ourselves in a place where it has rotten our culture?
I can understand the perspective, but I think it is far better than the alternative. I think it's far better than the alternative. I don't think it's that dissimilar to the arguments that a lot of people who want gun control or out-control gun bans, for example, in the USA, I don't think it's dissimilar to the argument they would use, which is that guns are dangerous, and there's a lot of them out there, and some people do bad things with them far more than you are doing with words, right? There are people who will go out and commit a mass shooting or murder someone or go into school and do this, and so therefore that freedom is too dangerous to exist. So we need to curb that freedom. We need to take an authoritarian approach and punish everybody and restrict and limit everybody in the name of safety or security. It's the exact same thing they did during the pandemic, right? They said that, well, freedom is too dangerous, right? They started calling it freedom, D-U-M-B, right? All you people advocating, against the mandates and against the lockdowns and against the...
That's using the weapon against the people in a negative way.
Yeah, but that's using the language of safety and security to curb basic individual rights and liberties. And I think
which is mostly born out of fear, which is an emotion.
As fear, yes, absolutely. So whilst I can understand people saying that, well, with freedom of speech, that means that someone can, use that nasty word, or someone can say this, or someone can say that. And, I don't like all speech. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that I don't like. There's lots of art that exists that I don't consume. There's a lot of music that's out there that I don't consume. A lot of books I don't want to read, things I don't want to consume. But I don't think that means that because it offends my personal sensibilities, then no one else should be allowed to consume it or speak it. Number one, I don't even think it's enforceable if you even truly wanted to. And also, who would be the arbiter? If you think the arbiter of this realistically would be the people in the political system, it would be the same politicians and bureaucrats who are making all of these bad decisions. I can't think of a single politician who I would trust to determine what language, what speech is permissible and what is not, what is safe and what is dangerous and so on, right? They'll be gunning for us. They'll say, well, you think they're going at Kanye? They'd be going at everybody. They'd be like, no.
It was one of the French revolutionists, I think, which, that's a topic all of its own, who said the pen is mightier than the sword. And so we have common sense, and I'm not going with a political position on it, but there's rules about using a gun. You don't put a gun in somebody's hand unless you explain to them the power of it, how to use it safely, how to use it properly, how not to hurt, how not to harm, and what it's really made for. We also have one of our founding fathers, I think it might have been Hamilton, I don't know, who said that our form of government, which was supposed to be a republic, will only stand in an environment that has morality,
Mhm.
moral people. I don't got the exact quote.
I think it's for moral and religious people and completely insufficient to any other something like that.
Right. So we have freedom of speech, but yet we have no moral code. We have no moral law. We have no moral boundaries
Mhm.
in our culture. And you can see that because you look at the media.
Can I? I would push back on that a little. I think at the extremes there is some truth to that, but when I exist in the real world and I travel around the USA and I meet people and I talk to people and I interact and I observe people, I do think that most people have pretty solid moral and ethical codes and boundaries. I do completely agree that there's some real degeneracy and inversion that is being pushed out there. And some of it is in the mainstream. Some of it's now in the schools and in the universities and so on. We're very aware of that. But when I see the typical person, the average American or the average British person and so on, they're not so far unmoored from morality and decency and ethics. I mean, if we were, I think things would look far, far, far more chaotic. You'd go out there on the street and it would be lawlessness. It would be mayhem. People would just be attacking from each other, not, violating each other all the time. I go out there. People are generally being respectful and polite. Even when we talk about some of the extreme degenerate issues and you ask people their thoughts on it, I'm not meeting a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I think that's
Would
good.
you say that most people behave as if morality is subjective, or do you believe that morality is objective?
I think that morality is, honestly, I think there's stuff that's black and white. I think there's stuff that's objective. I do think that there are some things where you can always think of situations and areas where things do become more gray. There are various situations on various levels where something, for example, that is, say you take something that would typically be considered wrong and immoral and a sin. We can probably imagine a situation where, from a moral perspective, it would be gray, right? So say something like telling a lie, right? Or something even greater, stealing, right? We would all generally agree that it's wrong to tell a lie. It's immoral. It's a sin. It's wrong to steal. We could probably also, with our intellect, think of a situation where telling a lie may be justified and could even be the correct and moral thing to do, right? Exceptions. We could also think of a situation where perhaps stealing something, right? If you've got this person is going to starve if I haven't got the money here. If I don't take this thing and give this to this person's going to starve to death. I think most people would agree, okay, in that situation, the greater sin would be to let this individual starve rather than to steal. And so I think that I do certainly believe in objective morality. I do think that there are gray areas. There are gray areas, and there are situations where, depending on how someone views the world and the specific situation and what's at hand, it's the trolley problem situation where it's like, well, is that you can argue both sides. Okay, I think that's the better option, or I think that's the better option. I don't know. This is not there's no good place to stand in a massacre. This is a morally gray zone.